just when we really look to scientists when they say we're in an Anthropocene, we're in a different, geological record. And it's like, well, you can't really refute like geological time over something. Like, we're doing something of some ways. And so like to I guess ground ourselves in that we're living in the Anthropocene, like that alone should ground us in how we look about life, how we deal with cultures and things. But then I guess this would be a good time to, I guess, introduce people to the concept of kind of meta-modernism, and then versus, which you've kind of brought up in some of your writing, as hyper-modernism. And so I guess like maybe we should just like distinguish between that. It's kind of like different techno futures. Like we're going along these one paths, and we take different paths of our history behind us, and we kind of project them into our future and our present. But like which way we go in that techno future is kind of distinct on how we critique it, how we be honest in our language about it, who we fund and give credence to. So I guess like let's just kind of unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, I'll try to give a crash course on my version of metamodernism, because it starts at the end of the Cold War.
Okay.
And as you may know, I only came across this research later, but Albert Borgman sort of developed a theory way before it was cool. He's writing in 1989 at a conference with a bunch of other people, right? So the whole conference proceedings are quite interesting, but Borgman is basically formulating a schism in postmodernism, recognizing that the culture is waning, that there's some sort of transition happening. And he named it as a bifurcation into meta-modernism and hyper-modernism. And so that was kind of lost academically, right? That was kind of forgotten. And even Borgman himself kind of didn't use that language further. He continued to write and write about things like American democracy, but without those terms. And so I think it was a missed opportunity, both by him and by everybody else, to not recognize these contributions, not to formalize it more, because that's exactly what happened 20 years later, right? With you have postmodernisms emerging, various names, about a dozen different terms to go beyond postmodernism, and then Vermeulen and Van den Acker, formalizing it, not including Borgman in that synthesis, whether it was conscious or just accidental. And various other authors, right? Gonzalez and Okadiji, I think is his name. So there's all these sort of prescient, kind of emergent discourses that I tried to synthesize later as all these other things are coming online. And of course, Hansi Freinacht kind of presents himself as an embodiment of these artistic metamodern values and cultural critiques that are already extant at that point. So to this day, it's kind of a mishmash of all of that. As we speak, there's supposed to be a book coming out from Perspectiva Press, which I have a chapter in. That's supposed to come out this month. It's pretty late in the month now. Maybe it's not going to happen.
Okay.
But that's a full-on book that has been in the works for a few years now, to kind of draw together some of these questions and authors and meta problems.
Are you familiar with Timothy Morton's work? Like dark objects, or hyper objects, and dark ecology. I mean, like nothing says, and Jeremy Johnson, one of we did another podcast with him, and we talked a little bit about this, how, COVID is a great example of like a hyper object. It just pulls you in everything single direction. It just wants energy, basically, in itself. And climate change is another way. Like, it's entwined in almost everything that we can think of, and the only way to really think of it is through that like entwinement, that abstraction and stuff. And we'll get more into that. But like, I mean, I think, those are some of the interesting, more descriptors of our age. And so I don't know if you have any other ones that kind of go along those lines. But I think, Timothy Morton's hyperobjects and kind of dark ecology, it kind of flirts with the same things.
Yeah. So Vermeulen and Vandenacker's work includes speculative realism, and triple O, what we're talking about as part of metamodernism. We can say, okay, that's fine, because I find a lot of value in the hyperobject concept too. Obviously, climate change is the best example, but the military-industrial complex, I think people really need to understand when they invoke that term, they're talking about something very huge and irreducible and so many moving parts, like,
good point.
Even people within it are disoriented or just caught up in some sort of ideology. So I don't think that's
Stockholm syndrome through an entire society. And
that definitely links to hypermodernism. But what I was going to say is I have reservations only because the modern monetary theory crowd, who I follow quite closely, they kind of disregard and reject speculative realism and speculative materialisms and that kind of thing. And I'm still trying to grapple with what the complete argument is.
How so? Because
divergence.
Because as I understand it, that's basically like, we can just print as much money as we want. It's like it doesn't really matter like what infrastructure kind of things we need. We just need to get it done. And so because before, in the last couple of decades, it was, we can't do this. Oh my God, we're gonna debt deficits, all this other stuff. And then now this new theory's come out and said, no, like spend your way into like prosperity, and so like I don't know if you can critique that, but like kind of maybe synergize those two things for the listeners.
So MMT is becoming more salient and credible as a public discourse about public money, how money can be spent and mobilized for public goods. And that in its essence is something that's always resonated with me since being a kid. Like you look around as a kid and there's lots of adult dysfunction that you can point out and understand and be like, why is the world this way? And there's lots of reasons that becomes path dependent and, entrenched, but you can kind of, without being naive or magical about it, you can imagine just less military spending and more spending on public infrastructure, right? And that's not, you don't even need to go into MMT to make that argument. But when it comes to how they're at odds with the meta-modernists or speculative realists, it's a lot to do with kind of the how they orient to the aesthetics of modernity, right? Whether that's just the way kind of cities are organized or big budget movies are made, tentpole movies. So they have a really interesting kind of reinvigoration of critical theory that I think maybe the speculative realists aren't even attempting.
Right.
And so there's a kind of revival there, and I'm down with it because it directly kind of, the MMTers are also vocal about advocacy for queer stuff. They say money is queer, in fact, and therefore, Black Lives Matter just as much as critical race theory, right? And so these concepts have become like punching bags for the right.
Oh yeah, sure. Good.
And also just things I think objects that a lot of these theorists might distance themselves from, right? So it creates a tension there. So what I guess I might not be able to unpack all the intricacies of these conflicts, but at the end of the day, it lends to a kind of auto-critique and skepticism of philosophical work itself. So I mean, to get into a position where you're problematizing Timothy Morton, whatever he's doing, that's a very hypercritical view. Mm-hmm. And if it's like, I just want to be on board with it if it's accurate.
Sure,
you know,
sure.
so we're drawn to kind of a truth attractor wherever it might be, because I do believe that our fate when it comes to like logistically dealing with climate change depends on some sort of meta theoretical convergence and new sort of language emerging that more people can understand each other.
Right. So way more in a cooperative vein in a lot of different abstract levels, like you said, in language and like even just how logistics happen. That's interesting. I want to kind of pull in some threads. You said you kind of did some roughneck work and stuff, and we were just talking about problems and problematizing and things like that, and then truth. And one of the concepts I think you'll know, or as a heuristic that I like, and we can maybe get into more heuristics in this juncture, is key logs. And so it's like the idea of a key log is, back in the old time, they would throw these big trees down the river, and it would go from point A to point B where the mill is, and they'd saw them up. But sometimes there'd be too many logs that basically would get in and get all crumpled up and stop and make like an artificial dam. And then these dudes would that were specialty key loggers, they would go and then get, this is one of the most dangerous jobs, I guess, probably in the history. You know what I mean? Like basically go on a floating wooden thing, and then you have to identify which one is like the crux point, the key log, that if you move that key log, then the entire thing, it's basically the most efficient way to undo a backup. Whatever the most lowest kind of like denominator is. And obviously there could be multiple key logs. We're not getting into that, but a key log is that that's one thing that you can just pop, and then it just kind of pops out. So I kind of want to look into that. Let's I guess unpack is that there is a log there, and a lot of people, there's industries that packed up that tell people that there's not a backup. In the river, there's and so let's talk about a little bit about truth and maybe some of that merchants of doubt, because we just talked about a hyper object in the military industrial complex, and one of the things that you just talked about in speculative realism and stuff is or I guess adjacent is the manufacturing consent, is that all these military and people, they have first say on all these movies that are coming out to literally then make the public discourse be in that viewpoint. Hurt Locker, Black Hawk Down, very U.S. centric, etc. Films, and then you automatically have almost a zeitgeist ideology coming forth from that is not truthful. So I mean, let's maybe unpack some of those things. And I don't know if you had heard the key log thing, but that's kind of one of the biggest heuristics that I've been looking at recently.
Yeah, I wasn't familiar with the terminology, so that's interesting. Because I mean, I never had to do any of that, because what you're referring to is when they did send it down the river. Sure, yeah. Freestyle, which is crazy, but that's our ancestors.
That's our history, Brent.
Exactly,
wild people doing.
Yeah, I mean, we can't even imagine the mega construction projects of the past and all the manual labor. But I didn't know the term key log, but it's analogous to I think it's called a keystone. When you're building an arch, and the keystone is the last one you put in place that holds it together. And if you were to take that out, it would fall. So where to go with that?
Well, I mean, it's just like when we were talking about, hyper, the military industrial complex, like we were talking about hyper objects and something that's basically permeating through society. It can have its own will, and I just wrote an essay called Technopoly that basically talks about Neil Postman's book and how technology, really has a mind of its own. And, us being the inventors really, even though we made it, we're not the best judge if it's good or bad and sad and how it's used and this. And then honestly, you can get to the point where, fossil fuel or what, I mean, maybe not a demarcation of that, but you can get to another hyper object that could mess the planet up and cause human extinction. And then right here, some of that hyper object may be even, polluting the discourse to then even let it happen, that we are none the wiser, and that's kind of like climate change in a nutshell, and merchants of doubt and Exxon and that kind of stuff. So just trying to, public truth and discourse. I was just trying to maybe riff on those kind of things.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, in the news on a regular basis, alternative news, but Steve Donziger is a lawyer who went after Chevron.
And yes, I have been seeing this case. Yes, yes.
He's been under house arrest for like 2 years or something. And I remember listening to him on like Democracy Now! Like 4 or 5 years ago, and just thinking like, this is the real shit. Like this is a guy whose career it is to really embed himself in networks of resistance to capitalism and change. And what I noticed though was that even back then, the story wasn't getting enough support and credit, right? You'd only hear about it through outlets like Democracy Now! But so there's that, but also just in response to everything else you're saying about how saturated we are with military culture, like it's so overdetermined, right? And there's so many assumptions baked into these different film projects like Zero Dark 30 or whatever it is. but to kind of play devil's advocate, what pops into my head is, I think his name's Mark Milley. He's like a American general. It's kind of went viral in the last couple of days because he made some positive comments kind of with regard to critical race theory and that whole moral panic, right? The whole right-wing hysteria, to call it what it is. Here you have a general, he's like on the face of it, like not particularly political, but recognizes the intellectual aspect that is prefigurative of war, right? So here's a guy who, listening to him, you can tell he's reasonable and actually wants to avoid war, right? Which is not, I don't think he's the norm in the military industrial complex. I think he's an outlier who, thank God, has been very successful, right? And has sort of risen the ranks. But you need more people like that, because
he said it was one of the biggest things is he said that he needed to be well read. I think it was operational awareness or situational awareness was the key word he used. And it's like, he's not like, I mean, regardless, let's just take it even from his most like objective stance. Like, don't even give him, let's have the most skepticism and the most criticism that he wants to go bloodthirsty, kill everyone. It's like, even at that level, you want to understand what the fuck is going on. You know what I mean? And it's like, what is going on inside your ranks? What is going on in the outside culture? What is going on? And things. And it's like the fact that he's taking an intellectual humility of that he does not know everything. That alone is, I think, the biggest thing, because all these other people are saying, no, I know this. And the thing that I am pushing knows it, and it's only right. And it's like the fact that he's saying, hey, I don't know everything, and I need to be well read, and I need to understand even things like Mao Zedong and, all this other stuff. And I'm not that, like, it's like, oh, wait, that gets more on the intelligent side, the more coherent side. And like what you were talking about, muddying the waters. It's like, there's been a lot of, incoherence, and the fact that you find some coherence with just, basic common sense stuff of like having some intellectual humility, learning and steel manning your own arguments by learning about what you're going up against. It's like, that's just basic debate tactics. You know what I mean? Like, you don't have to get too crazy, even military awareness. So like, even the fact of that is an interesting thing, that you bring up. So Mark Milley, kudos to him. Interesting. Do you have any other favorite heuristics? I mentioned the keylog in my ebook, Tripping Over the Truth, kind of having your own heuristics, or having your own biases and then tripping over them, having them, put forth in front of you. Do you have any other heuristics that, you kind of love?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, before the call, you mentioned my film. And you said you watched it and you're a fan, and that's great, because otherwise I can't invoke these things, right? But in the film, there's a fair bit about heuristics. Yep. And there's even a scene where the protagonist literally trips in the forest. He trips over a root, and the idea there was that he was taking a self-administered acid test, right? So he was doing LSD and doing some self-exploration, running through the forest, trips over a root. So it's like a very on the nose visual metaphor for this. And after that point in the film, he, you know, has realizations. He kind of starts to have one epiphany after another. And earlier in the film, there's a bit about heuristics too. And the example I use actually is standing desks. And this is totally off topic, but I'm just using it as an example because, you know, or, you know, set it and forget it is a kind of
Ronco?
Yeah, yeah.
I do that to my girlfriend all the time. I'm like, set it and forget it. And she had never seen those commercials. And it's like, that is hilarious that you just said that. Like, oh my God, that's funny.
Yeah. So we all operate on heuristics all the time, partially without even knowing it. And so it's so critical to know and to try to iterate on your heuristics. And of course, the point I'm making there with the film is that drugs can facilitate that. But also, you know, philosophy itself. If you're serious about a philosophical pursuit, you'll come to those same questions and answers regardless.